Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Phantom FM. I'm Phantom, and every week we're going to grab a cup of coffee and chat about everything happening in the World of Warcraft, along with anything spooky in the gaming world that we happen to be obsessed with. So grab your coffee, settle in, little lanterns, and let's get into it. First things first, let's talk about everything happening in Azeroth. Before we get into the updates, hot fixes, and blue posts, I want to tell you what I actually did in WoW this week. So I got to play quite a bit of be- I got to play quite a bit because a buddy of mine from high school came to visit. Um, Playing together again remind me of how much I used to love the game when our old guild was together, still up and running. That uh, you know, nostalgic feel. It was fun. I missed it. It brought some of those nostalgic days where logging into WoW wasn't just about completing your weekly tasks, it was about getting online, spending time with your friends, and, having a good time. Anyways, uh, I finally managed to get my monk geared to item level 285, and yay. Uh I'd been trying to get to mythic level back piece for a while, but pugging's something I really struggle with. Eventually I decided to stop waiting for the perfect piece to drop, and I just crafted one. It was just easier. Sometimes, honestly, you have to accept that the game's not going to give you what you need and solve the problem yourself. Um, to get my monk to that item level, though, I still had to run some Mythic Plus keys. Anyone who watches my Twitch content probably already knows that I hate pugging, and it's one of the main things that makes gearing really difficult for me. Um, Luckily, while my friend was visiting, we were able to run keys with him, one of his friends, and Demonic, who you may already know as my personal light. Um, as a little nod to Death Note, my old Misa persona. And anyways, Demonic made me tank. I'm not particularly comfortable taking, so that was an experience in itself. Um, Anyways, this week's affixes were fairly manageable from a tanking perspective. We had the pulsar affix, which creates those little void orbs that orbit around a player, and you need to touch the other player's orbs or balls to get rid of them. Anyways, we also had fortified and tyrannical, and I'm not gonna explain those. You guys know what that is. Um, but overall, I found the affix combination, it was fairly easy to handle as a tank, especially with the right build. A lot of tanks prefer to run a damage focus build instead of prioritizing survivability, which I personally disagree with that mentality. It isn't always about your parse. Getting everyone safely to the end of the key and making the healer's job a little bit easier should be the priority. More damage is great, but not if you're making the rest of the group work harder just so your numbers look better. Um, but as for my most frustrating part of tanking for me is remembering my routes. I can manage my defensives, I can hold threat, I can usually keep myself alive, but remembering exactly which packs to pull, what percentage each group gives, and which route everyone expects me to know is where I start to stress. Blizzard does now have a newer system designed to help tanks learn dungeon routes called Lindormi's Glow. Um, you can activate it by speaking with Lim Dormy near the Time Ways portal or at the end of your keystone in the dungeon. You can also turn it off again by speaking with her. Uh, I think that is genuinely helpful for people who want to try tanking but feel intimidated, like myself, by the responsibility of leading the group. Despite being nervous, though, I think I did fairly well. Part of the joy of playing WoW is putting yourself into the situation that makes you uncomfortable and finding out whether you can do it. Um, it's challenging, but that challenge is also part of the fun. Um, Speaking of fun, I also race changed one of my previous main healers, my shaman, the one called Kira, to the Harnar race. I really like the way they look, and I am definitely someone who is a cosmetic person. It's all about the cosmetics for me, honestly. I hadn't leveled it yet, and I was planning to do it, but apparently all I needed was a new look for motivation to finally start. Um, Sometimes fashion really is the true end game. Anyways, working on my house was another thing that I got into this week, and I have really been enjoying it. Um, I'd been wanting to do more with it for a while, and I finally have a house that I'm genuinely happy with. Uh, is there more I want to add? Absolutely. There's always going to be one more room to decorate, one more item I want, one more thing that doesn't look quite right. Um, I'll get there eventually. But housing itself is a bit of a love-hate relationship for me because I love the idea of it, but the amount of gold it can require feels like a major deterrent. That's one of the reasons I spent so much time at the beginning of the X Pack trying to earn at least 1 million gold through leatherworking, and I knew that if I wanted to properly enjoy housing, I was gonna need the gold to support it, obviously. um the most frustrating part of my week, though, was getting disconnected repeatedly. Demonic's been troubleshooting the problem, and unfortunately, we may need to replace our router. Uh, there's nothing like being in the middle of a dungeon and wondering whether the boss mechanics or your internet connection are gonna kill you first. Yeah, wasn't fun, but you know. Moving on to the hot fix corner. Um, what actually happened in WoW this week? Honestly, the hot fixes were not huge. There was some PvP fixes involving the Rune of Lingering. Its damage over time effects will no longer interrupt the flag captures. Makes sense. I don't PvP much myself, but it's an obvious fix. I'm glad they dealt with it before it was an issue, and yeah. Um, there was a few annoying quest related issues fixed. There was a mythic quest item in Mycera Caverns, should now drop correctly. Grand Magister Romath now provides a portal to the Magister's Terrace for Omnium Folio weekly quests. Light hook, grapple, extra action button should now also only appear in the places where it's actually supposed to be available, which, that's good. None of the changes are especially exciting, but it removes some frustration, I guess. Overall, not much in hot fixes this week. I mean, no news is good news. It's an obvious good sign, right? Working as intended. Anyways, moving on to the blue posts. The main blue posts this week were interesting, although we're still fairly quiet overall since I spend most of my time playing healers, and that's the area. And no, I'm gonna focus primarily on the healer changes. Um, there were changes to other classes as well, so I'll include the full blue post in the description for anyone who wants to look through everything. A lot of the healer changes this week appear to be focused on PvP, but not all of them. I don't personally play much PvP, so I'm looking at these changes more broadly and thinking about how the abilities feel to use and what direction Blizzard appears to be taking on each healer. Once again, restoration shamans receive no love. This is becoming something of a recurring theme, judging by the comments under the healer tuning posts. Hopefully Blizzard gives some attention soon, because I imagine there's already quite a few unhappy Resto Shaman players, especially on the PvP side. Um, Moving on, let's talk about Resto Druid. Um, they received a 25% healing buff to regrowth. My first thought is that I don't think the average resto druid is necessarily going to notice this as much as the numbers might suggest. Regrowth can be a very mana intensive spell. um, I do use it, but I'm also thinking about how it works alongside with the rest of my build. When I pair healing with damage and use talents such as Master's Shapeshifter to help regain mana, regrowth becomes easier to work into my gameplay. So for my particular playstyle, I would probably notice a 25% buff. Someone who avoids using regrowth because of the mana cost might not suddenly begin using it just because the healing number is larger. The buff improves the spell, but it doesn't completely remove the reasons some players hesitate to cast it. That being said, if you have been thinking about trying a healing style that weaves more damage into the rotation, this might be a good time to try giving Resto Druid another chance. Um, Preservation Evoker also received some changes, and Blizzard included a developer note explaining its reasoning. Blizzard's position appears to be that preservation is too strong in raid content, but it isn't performing as well in Mythic Plus. Personally, I don't see many preservation evokers being played right now. It may be performing well in raids, but its position in Mythic Plus and the fact that it's not as immediately approachable as something like Holy Priest may discourage some players from choosing it. Um, Preservation has a distinctive style, and not everyone clicks with it. The problem is that if the spec isn't seen as strong in Mythic Plus, preservation players may be less likely to get accepted into random groups. That makes it harder for those players to gear the characters and show what the spec is capable of. Because of that, I think improving the dungeon side of preservation is beneficial. It gives the spec a better chance at being considered outside of the raids without necessarily allowing it to remain overly dominant in every type of content. Um, Now we get to Mistweaver Monk. All healing has been reduced by 8%. Yeah, this one hurts. Um, Seeing one of my current mains receive an overall healing nerf is never gonna make me happy. At the same time, I also understand why Blizzard's trying to do it. Um, Mistweaver is performing extremely well, and it's currently near the top. So Blizzard's trying to bring it more in line with the other healers. Do I understand the vision? Yeah. Do I like the change? Not really. Mistweaver has other abilities and parts of its toolkit that Blizzard could have adjusted instead of applying a broad percentage reduction to all healing. It feels like a very direct way to bring the spec down rather than a particularly interesting one. I understand why they're doing it, but I'm still not pleased about it. Um, Holy Paladin. Uh, they receive some buffs. It's another healer currently sitting around the lower tiers. I've tried Holy Paladin, but I've not really enjoyed the spec since it changed from the way it played during Cataclysm. Because of that, this is one of the healers I have the least current personal experience with. Holy Shock's mana costs has been decreased by 11%. From what I've personally seen, mana's not appeared to be the biggest issue for Holy Paladins, although I would need to spend more time with the spec to properly judge that. Holy Shock's healing was also increased, paired with the reduced mana cost that could potentially help move Holy Paladin higher in the healing rankings. I'm not confident enough with my modern Holy Paladin to say exactly how much it'll change the spec, but it's at least a meaningful looking buff rather than a tiny number adjustment. Moving on to Holy Priest. They received another round of buffs. Prayer of Mending's healing was increased by 20%, and Oracle's prompt prognosis was increased by 30%. I don't think this changes Holy Priest very much, but I do think it moves the spec in a positive direction. Prayer of Mending's already a core ability, especially when playing Oracle. If you regularly if you are regularly sitting on two charges, you're probably doing something wrong. The main the main time I would deliberately hold it is when I know a large burst of damage is coming and I want the charges available for that moment. The problem is that the that prayer mending has not been contributing a particularly large amount of healing. Um, Increasing its healing by 20% means an ability that Holy Priests already use should now feel a little more worthwhile. It doesn't change the rotation though. You're still pressing the same ability in the same situations. It's simply gonna produce a larger number. Um, Holy Priest is currently considered one of the lower tier healing specs, so Blizzard appears to be trying to raise its overall throughput. I think that it's a good direction. I just don't think that particular change is going to make a dramatic difference to where Holy Priest sits. The 30% increase to prompt prognosis combined with the Prayer of Mending buff should create a small improvement to Holy's overall healing, but does Holy Priest actually need more healing? Honestly, I'm not convinced that raw healing numbers are the main problem. Holy's one of the easier and more straightforward healing specs. When a spec has a simple, accessible playstyle, adding more throughput doesn't really make the gameplay itself more interesting. The numbers will go up, but the class will not suddenly feel different, you know? Moving on to Disgrace. Uh, they receive several changes. Penance damage and healing were increased by 15%. Grim Deliverance now increased Shadow's Mend healing by 40% instead of 30, while its additional cast time has been reduced from zero point 0.5 seconds to zero point 0.3 seconds. Atonement healing will now fall off more sharply when healing more than 5 targets. And according to the developer notes, when healing exactly 10 targets, atonement will be about 7% less effective than it was before. Eesh. Void Shield's absorption was also reduced by 10%. Um, Disc is probably the most interesting healer to discuss here because it's always been somewhat of a niche and difficult spec to play. It can be one of the stronger healers, but execution matters more than almost anything else. You have to understand when major damage is about to happen, apply your atonements before the damage is going out. Preemptive healing. You can't always wait until everyone's already hurt, then react. Reactive healing. You have to prepare preemptively. And that's what makes disc rewarding, but it's also what makes the spec difficult for the average person to learn. Reducing Atonement's effectiveness in larger groups makes an already demanding healer even less forgiving. I don't think that it's necessarily a great change for players who are already trying to learn Disc. At the same time, I can see how it makes the spec even more interesting for experienced or hardcore players who enjoy mastering its timing. I like that Disc has a higher skill cap. I just don't think that cap has to become so intimidating that newer players decide it's not worth trying, you know? And finally, Resto Shamans. Again, no love. What's new? Are you surprised? I'm not. um, Welcome back to the weekly Restoration Shaman Watch, where we check whether Blizzard has remembered the spec exists. The answer is still no. Well, that's enough from Azeroth. Let's dim the lights, grab our flashlights, and head into the night shift. This week in Phasmophobia, the weekly challenge is called Detectives Only. And this one is definitely not for beginners. The challenge is pretty simple to explain, but it's harder to complete. You have to figure out the ghost with zero evidence. So, if you're someone who relies on checking EMF, spirit box, fingerprints, and all that, good luck. Now, that's not to say it's impossible. Honestly, I think challenges like this are what make Phasmophobia so much fun. They force you to stop relying on evidence and start paying attention to the ghost itself. Like their hunting behavior, abilities, movement, and all those little details that are easy to forget and ignore during a normal investigation. I actually think learning those things makes you a much better ghost hunter in the long run. That being said, I fully expect to get absolutely destroyed while trying to finish this challenge. So if you happen to see me streaming it, try not to laugh too hard. Before we wrap things up, it's time for Phantom's Field Notes. Every week, I'm going to share one interesting thing about a ghost that might just help you survive your next investigation. The Obake. Did you know the Obake is the only ghost that can leave a six-fingered fingerprint? Now, don't go running back to the truck just because you don't see one. It doesn't happen every time. But if you're checking a door or a light switch and suddenly you notice six fingers instead of five, congratulations. You probably just found yourself an Obake. And that's it for this week's Phantom Field Notes. One ghost, one trick, one less thing to get you killed. So if you're taking on this week's challenge, let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear what ghost gave you the hardest time, or whether you managed to survive Detectives Only without losing your mind. Good luck, investigators. Well, little lanterns, that brings us to the end of episode 1 of Phantom FM. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, let me know what you think down in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts on this week's healer changes, and if you're a Resto Shaman player, I'm sorry. Next week, we'll be back with another trip through Azeroth, another stop working the night shift, and hopefully a few more stories to share. Until then, take care of yourselves, and as always, keep the lanterns lit.